I just want to welcome Simon Dixon to the show, the expert on all things Bitcoin, the financial industrial complex, and how money flows and impacts geopolitics. His favorite line is follow the money. Appreciate, Simon, you coming onto the show. I really want to hear your thoughts about Bitcoin and the connection with Epstein. How are you doing?
All good. Yeah, I mean, it's a wild time right now. This is the unmasking phase of everything. And so, yeah, it's a pretty crazy time. So just trying to apply some of my 25 years of finance to helping us figure out what some of these crazy things that are happening in the world are. So let's jump in.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Okay. So the Epstein files have been released, and I know you've been speaking a lot about it. You've been an early adopter of Bitcoin. There are certain things in the file which speak about Bitcoin, speak about Epstein's investments. And so let's take one thing at a time. What did you find in the files which may suggest a Epstein funding the early adoption of Bitcoin? What you call it? The early kind of founders of Bitcoin or the developers of Bitcoin being on the Epstein list. And then we'll also talk about the possibility of Epstein being Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah, sure. So, look, it's such a nuanced subject that people's, desire to get an attention grabbing headline means that pretty much everyone's getting it wrong. And look, I'll start with the fact that I've been involved in Bitcoin since it was $3, 2011, invested in 100 different companies, know the inside track of lots of this stuff, seen people go from purist to off the rails, and seen infiltration and compromise all along the way. There's not a lot I haven't seen, made every mistake, distanced myself from people when I need to, been connected with people who have disappointed me. So, everything that I'm sharing is kind of from firsthand experience. If I believed that Bitcoin was a Mossad op, was supporting crimes against humanity in Israel, and was propped up by, or was, a creation of pedophiles and various other things. I'd sell all my Bitcoin, I'd buy gold, and I'd tell everyone why I sold Bitcoin. I'm at that stage in life. But so what did we learn from the Epstein files? Firstly, we learned that Jeffrey Epstein, who's a compromise agent, whose job is to compromise all levels of power in order to utilize those connections, use degeneracy and, heinous crimes to make sure that it props up a power network of people that, kind of props up power. So that's what we know about Jeffrey Epstein. So Bitcoin was created as a white paper in 2008. The first line of code was in 2009. The very first developer outside of, the first miner was Hal Finney and Satoshi Nakamoto, who I suspect I know who they are. But we still don't have full confirmation. And then you had a bunch of developers that joined an open source project. One of the first developers that I ever met that introduced me to the project via a connection from the monetary reform movement was a guy called Amir Taki. Now, Amir Taki was the first person that I noticed whose name was, you can search for Amir Taki in the files. And that was around 2011 when Jeffrey Epstein was trying to, based upon the emails, assuming they're all real, was trying to figure out who to connect with within the Bitcoin community. And Amir Taki was one of the developers at the time. This is 2 years after, the very early implementations of the code. And so if we're to believe these emails, it's confirmation that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't Satoshi. But Jeffrey Epstein was trying to figure out who he should connect with. And I think his goal was to compromise as many people and figure out what this was all about. Now, I know from firsthand experience that this was around the time that Amir Taki was looking at creating alternatives to Bitcoin, and he was involved in a project called Darkcoin and Dark Wallet, which wanted to take the properties of Bitcoin and make it more private. That project later got rebranded to Dash, and it's still a cryptocurrency that exists today. So the way I interpret this is that Jeffrey Epstein initially was trying to figure out who everyone was, and then the first developer that we've got confirmation that he made contact with and tried to send some funding to was Amir Taki, who was involved in privacy coins and taking implementations of Bitcoin and trying to make it more private so that no one could trace the transactions. Um,
So that's one person that was in the files, right? He was in the files. He communicated with Jeffrey Epstein, I believe. Sorry, Jeffrey Epstein asked for his contact, I believe, in 2011, and later there is clear evidence that he not only he communicated with him and maybe had a lot of engagement with him. Correct?
Yeah, and look, Amir Taki is a crazy guy. Like I've had various interactions with him over time. Firstly, he invited me to speak at the first Bitcoin conference in Prague.
Mm.
He is an anarchist. He was one of the very early faces of Bitcoin, Gavin Andreessen and Amir Taki. And people used to go to squats in Old Street where he would clearly be on drugs, talking about how Bitcoin is freedom and people can use it to buy whatever they want. And so, this is an anarchist deeply involved in all sorts of things. Even later, like some wild stories about Amir Taki, he went to go and fight ISIS in Syria. And he was on the front line fighting ISIS, after the ISIS invasion. And he came back to UK and he was arrested on the border and he had to explain what he was doing in Syria. So this is the kind of person, that we're talking about here. Doesn't come from money, not wealthy from my understanding. He never got rich from Bitcoin because he kept spending his Bitcoin. And round about that time, there was nobody that was interested in our industry. I was one of the only that was investing in companies, and a guy called Roger Ver. No venture capitalists, no Peter Thiels. This wasn't sophisticated at this stage. This was like a bottom-up, crazy movement. And if a billionaire knocks on your door and says, "Hey, I want to invest in your project," it's like one of the only sources of funding you could imagine. But we already know in 2008 that Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender. And
Right.
on some of Amir Taki's early posts on Bitcoin, all the conversation happened on Bitcoin Talk Forum at the time.
Right. Okay.
And he had some post where he was renting out 16-year-old girls and selling them for anyone that wanted to buy them on this post. So that tells you about his character. He's actually came out. If you go to Amir Taki on X, you can see his response and his explanation. He's kind of saying, "Yeah, I took some money. We were involved in projects." And you can translate with from that. That's everything I know about Amir Taki, and that's the earliest interaction that seems credible from the file drop.
Okay. And so, what was his? What was his connection to Bitcoin again? What did he do in relation to Bitcoin?
So Bitcoin's an open source
Yeah.
code, so anyone can go to the GitHub repo and suggest code that they want to implement,
Mm.
and you can look at his entire history of what he implemented. But he got angry at Bitcoin because it wasn't private enough, and
Right.
so he kind of forked off into we need more privacy and we need different types of coins. And so he kind of went down this dark coin, Monero type of privacy coin route. So he kind of he kind of left the Bitcoin community route very early because he was just pissed off that it wasn't private enough.
So he was doing what you're saying is open source changes to Bitcoin, which everyone can verify. But what other engagement or interaction did he have other than that? Because I presume there'll be a lot of people who did the same thing through, is it Gift Hub you said, that
Yeah, so if you want to suggest code, you can suggest improvement proposals,
mm,
and you can write code and suggest it, and then it gets community reviewed, and then it has to go through a very comprehensive process of whether it gets adopted and whether people. So even if you suggest the most nefarious thing, you still got to get through all the community members, and I'm not sure how much of it. I'm not even sure if any of his code ever got implemented. But he was more of an advocate. He
mm.
was at one stage kind of like the CEO, as in the face of Bitcoin. The BBC loved him because he was he gave Bitcoin kind of a bad name in terms of associating it with drugs and stuff and things like Silk Road.
Hmm.
And so the media loved going there, and there was like they would go into his like what looked like a crack den and squat and stuff like that, and kind of associate it with Bitcoin.
Well, that
Uh,
that answers my question because what I was gonna ask was if he was just a random developer who was able to, as everybody else, suggest things, then why would Jeffrey Epstein want to contact him? Why would he uniquely want to contact him? But I guess your answer to that is that he end up becoming like the face of it. He end up getting notoriety through the media, and so hence why it logically makes sense that Jeffrey Epstein wanted to contact him. Is that right?
yeah, if you were around in early 2011, then you would know Amir Taki, Gavin Andreessen, Hal Finney, who was like behind the scenes but on the talk forums, and then enter someone like Roger Ver, who kind of the face was Amir Taki, which gave a very bad face. Then Gavin Andreessen kind of started taking up more of the public persona, and then it turned into Roger Ver, who was like the first articulate, like kind of libertarian but businessman, entrepreneur type person.
Mm.
And he kind of took the reins. I gave like my very first BBC interviews in. I mean, I recorded all my conferences, but I did some BBC interviews around about 2012.
Right.
But prior to that, it was that's what you would have known. And so if you were Jeffrey Epstein and you wanted to figure out what was going on in Bitcoin, you would have contacted Amir Taki.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, in terms of going and I do want to talk about the privacy element of it because Bitcoin isn't private, and so you have seen a lot of development. As you mentioned, Amir Taki wanted to do it, but in addition to that, we saw the recent development of Zcash, which essentially was branded as a privacy coin that was built or developed in Tel Aviv. Actually, let me ask you now. So, what was Jeffrey Epstein's connection to that?
Yeah, so if you look at the history, there's a bunch. So Bitcoin is pseudonymous, which means every transaction is public on a blockchain. It's not like you have a bank account so you can see the history of all your transactions. You can create a unique wallet for every transaction. And you can do things like CoinJoin to obfuscate transactions. And so people were really interested in things like CoinJoin and these different types of innovation to make transactions more private, even though it's pseudonymous. And so you don't know who anyone is, but every transaction is public on a blockchain and you can't change that. And so then the focus from more of the hardcore activists that were involved in things like purchasing drugs on Silk Road and more activities that were, part of more of like a libertarian type of movement. You had Ross Albright, that we found out was someone called the Dread Pirate Robert, and he later was known and arrested for creating Silk Road. And Silk Road was where people started this marketplace where you could buy anything online. Now, what was quite interesting at the time is one of the very early TV appearances was when the FBI was talking about Silk Road and connecting it to buying drugs, and they would always portray it as an anonymous currency. And so it kind of became like people would use Silk Road thinking it's an anonymous currency. And that obviously created a real honeypot around this Silk Road website of people that were trying to purchase drugs online, but creating these immutable records and connecting it to the only exchange where you could buy Bitcoin which was Mount Gox at the time. But that's kind of a bit of the history that leads to that. But then you had people that wanted to create alternatives to Bitcoin that were more private. The first one was Darkcoin, that later became known as Dash. Then there was a movement to try and create another alternative, which today is Monero. And then later there was a company which was who had people like Roger Ver invest in it. It had Barry Silbert invest in it, and Barry Silbert, his brother Alan Silbert. When I started advocating for Palestine, you can see on X, we always used to debate each other because he obviously has a deep affiliation for Israel, and you can also see that an exchange. So his brother Alan Silbert created an exchange called INX. And INX had like these very questionable Israeli type of people. So I haven't seen publicly Barry Silbert ever talk about Israel, but his brother seems to advocate for Israel, and I've argued with him on X many times, and he ended up blocking me eventually because I was, dismantling some of his Hezbollah. So you could assume that Barry Silbert has guilty due to association from his brother, whether that's true or not. But you could say that there's a connection there. And so Barry Silbert funded Zcash, and then it relied upon an innovation called zero knowledge proof.
Yeah.
What this meant is that you could send a transaction, and it could be fully anonymous. And the kind of the development around this technology is deeply associated with Tel Aviv University. A lot of cryptography and various other things, and military grade encryption and various other stuff. It all tends to come from NSA, CIA, Department of Defense, Tel Aviv as well, the Israeli connection. So Zcash essentially, it relied upon a trusted setup, and what it required is some trusted people to say, initially, we're going to destroy this key. And if I'm getting the tech wrong, it doesn't matter. But
Yeah.
the point is that there was a trusted setup. And one of the developers who I'm very skeptical of, he came around about 2014, is a guy called Peter Todd. If you look at his profile on X, he talks about advocating for a nuclear attack on Iran and various other things. So he and there were documentaries over time where they tried to claim he was Satoshi as well, but he came to the project a lot later. So Peter Todd was one of the people that you had to trust to destroy a part of the key in order to trust Zcash. And then people could send these zero knowledge transactions, but there was a tax on every transaction that went to a private corporation, a private company. And so, this was a very questionable project. It was connected to a company, and it was meant to be anonymous transactions. And then there was a trust element at the beginning, and then it's connected to all these kind of different technologies that came from Tel Aviv University. Jeffrey Epstein, anyway, it was confirmed from some of the emails, if we're to believe the emails, that he was one of the investors in that project. He showed this clear interest. Now, he may have been investing in everything he could, because that's kind of his strategy. You get access through investment, and then you try and compromise as you go further and further up the cycle. But he seemed to be heavily involved in Zcash as a project.
Yeah. Okay, so one question I've got for you, and then I'm going to come back because I've got a few more questions about the Epstein files and the links to Bitcoin. They are numerous. One of the questions, because you mentioned about the centralized nature, and you're basically relying on Todd to basically destroy the key, which, based on his background,
Zcash, not Bitcoin.
about Zcash, yeah, which
Yeah.
which is possible that he may not do it because he's not a honest broker, especially when you look at his view about what's happened in Gaza. But one of the things about, or one of the arguments against Bitcoin is that although it's claimed to be decentralized, in fact, it is actually centralized. And they talk about how a lot of the block production is um, is basically geared into four specific mining pools. You've got Foundry USA, which has 30%, and Pool 18%, via BTC, which has 11%, and FT Pool, which has 10%, which means that the top pools currently control 65% of all total hash power, and the top five over 75%. Does that not go against this idea of the decentralized nature of Bitcoin, and actually in the end it's become centralized?
Yeah, so you have to look at the entire architecture of Bitcoin, because what Bitcoin is it's lots of parts, and you just described one part, which is the
Yeah.
mining pools. And together, when you plug all these different parts together, you have the most decentralized, thing or supercomputer that exists, as it were, for transacting value. But within it, you always have attack vectors of centralization. But in itself, just by controlling a large percentage of the mining pool, you can centralize to the degree that you just said, which I agree with those stats. There's mainly four large mining pools.
Mm.
And what these mining pools are essentially, if you're a miner, you have to invest significant amount of money in hardware, infrastructure, electricity, and data centers, cooling, all sorts of stuff. It's a significant investment and operation. It was originally a laptop, then it was GPUs, and now it's dedicated, sophisticated data centers with ASICs. And when you're trying to mine, every new bitcoins are created every 10 minutes. And if you're mining, you essentially receive a block reward for mining, but only one miner receives that block reward because it's rewarded every 10 minutes. And so what a mining pool is essentially everybody takes all of their computer power and they connect it to a mining pool so that everybody pulls together their mining power. And then every time they find a block and gets a reward, it's split across everybody that's contributing to that mining pool. So what this does is it normalizes out your revenue. So you can guarantee every 10 minutes you'll probably get a piece of Bitcoin, rather than waiting 5 years and only getting 10 blocks or something. And so the mining pool was a way for splitting and guaranteeing that every 10 minutes or so you start to get Bitcoin. So what happens with the mining pools, if you take those, one of the largest ones is connected to a US company, and that's Digital Currency Group, which is a subsidiary called Foundry, that's connected to Barry Silbert. And then the other three are Chinese miners that were really very early on in the Bitcoin mining, which was predominantly done in China before there was kind of this massive movement of mining over to America. When China started to make Bitcoin mining illegal, even though they still mine today, there was a time when they had 60% of all the mining. Now it's got like 20%, and about 40% of it is in America. And so those mining pools, we have had moments when one of the mining pools that doesn't even really exist today, called ghash.io, started to get close to 50% of all the all of the mining hash power. The second it got there, you have a public campaign to explain the risk, and everybody starts reallocating their hash power to another miner. And what has been invented like quite recently is more mining pools where you can still have this centralized distribution, but everyone can have their own environment, called Oasis Pool. All this to say, I know it's very geeky, that while there are four major mining pools, it's trivial to move your power from one to the other. And there's new mining pools, which creates way more distributed, environments within a mining pool. And so that is a source of centralization with innovation that makes it more decentralized, and a trivial way that if this becomes a centralization risk, you can just move your mining over to another mining pool.
Understood. Now, going back to the Epstein files, one of the releases, and there's quite a few elements of it, one of the releases suggests that Israel through Epstein was paying 60% of Bitcoin core developers. And so they had them on the salary and essentially had control over the larger part of Bitcoin. And this was through a release that happened yesterday. What's your thoughts or views on that?
Okay, so the history of Bitcoin funding. So originally, the Bitcoin developers used to just put up a QR code, and anyone could send some Bitcoin, and it was more like a buy me a coffee in an anonymous, a pseudonymous environment. And that wasn't good enough. So because it wasn't giving developers enough stable revenue, I invested in a company called BitPay that later Peter Thiel invested in via Founders Fund, like a couple of years later. But I did a lot of the early rounds before all the VCs came in. And the BitPay basically said, I'll fund the development. And so this company did it. At that time, it was kind of like creating the PayPal or Bitcoin, allowing businesses to accept Bitcoin easily and convert it to dollars. And then the Bitcoin community thought, no, this is too risky. This is one company funding developers. And so the solution that came out was a bunch of companies and more companies came along, got together and created the Bitcoin Foundation, which was a not-for-profit foundation that had a bunch of board members. And those board members were people like, the CEO of Mt. Gox, Mark Cabellis, the CEO of BitInstant, Charlie Shrem, John Matonis, Bruce Fenton, who often comes up on spaces that we participate in, and Roger Ver as well. Basically, the big characters that wanted to publicly represent Bitcoin at the time.
So Bruce was one of the early guys.
Bruce Fenton, yeah, I mean he's OG. Yeah, Bruce Fenton's been around for a very long time. Yeah, and he's still coming up at the spaces, like still helping people out.
Yeah. So sorry, you were saying. Apologies.
Yeah, no worries. And so yeah, these people made up the Bitcoin Foundation. Now, this is when I think there was deliberate operations to try and infiltrate the Bitcoin Foundation. And so people would contribute to the Bitcoin Foundation, and everyone would complain and shout at it. It's like you have this foundation that's more decentralized than just BitPay paying, but everyone could contribute, and every Bitcoiner would give some money, like on a donation basis, and it would fund the developers. But as you have humans involved, you've got a centralized attack pool now. And so I think it was attacked through a guy called Brock Pierce, who joined the board.
Right.
And Brock Pierce, in the Epstein files, it was confirmed that he had meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, he came at it from a couple of ways. Firstly, he created a venture capital fund that would start one of the very first formal venture capital funds. Myself and Max Kaiser created one called Bitcoin Capital, and he created one called Blockchain Capital. And he would essentially be investing in any of the Bitcoin companies that he could find at the time. And Blockchain Capital is still around today. It's had multiple rounds. They've booted Brock Pierce off. They've tried to disassociate with Brock Pierce. But if you look at Brock Pierce's background, he had but firstly, his early career was he was a child actor in Hollywood. And we know how Hollywood as an industry is in general in terms of operations, just like Jeffrey Epstein's. And he was also somebody that blew up a company during the dot-com boom and bust. He was meant to go public. And during that time, there were allegations from minors, a minor that he settled with that made accusations around, sexual crimes. I don't want to mess up YouTube right now. You get the idea. And so he had that background. Now, his crimes went away. I think there was something, I could be getting things wrong of this, but this is just from memory. So he had a very questionable background, but he kind of, through financing, tried to overwhelm people because it was impossible to get financing at that time. There was, the first venture capitalist that came along. And so he at this time, got on the board of Bitcoin Foundation because he had money and he was the only one that really had money at that time. And he was involved in several things. He's a very important character, I think, here in understanding what happened. The story is that then later, the Bitcoin Foundation went through financial stress because there was loads of controversy. So one by one, all the board members got involved in controversy. Bruce Fenton, I haven't seen controversy around that time, but Charlie Schwem got taken down, arrested for supporting transactions to Silk Road. We also had Mt. Gox, an exchange that went bust very famously. It had 70% of all the Bitcoin. It was systemically an important exchange. And the interesting story about that is it was run by a guy called Mark Capellas, and everyone thinks he's the founder of Mt. Gox. He was on the board of the Bitcoin Foundation. He actually bought the exchange from a guy called Jeb McCaleb. And Jeb McCaleb he created the exchange. It was the reason it's called Mt. Gox. It was Magic the Gathering online exchange because it was for trading Magic the Gathering trading cards. And he repurposed it into a Bitcoin exchange because there was no price for Bitcoin at the time. People were just sending it. There was no way of, buying it. You had to mine it and send it to each other, and there was no price. And so he repurposed it into this exchange, and then he sold it to Mark Capellas. Now, this guy is interesting because he created the two cryptocurrencies. One was called XRP Ripple, and the other was called XLM Stellar. And this essentially became, the banksters operation with Ripple trying to disrupt Swift and stuff. But there was 80,000 Bitcoin missing. So he bought it without disclosing to Mark Capellas that the Bitcoin were missing. And so he ended up with this exchange that was missing 80,000 Bitcoin. And a bot was developed that pushed the price of Bitcoin from, like, when I got involved, it was $3 in 2011. But it pushed it up to like $1,000 or something. And so he ended up with this ginormous hole where he owed all this Bitcoin. The Bitcoin was missing. And it was just this, and there were hacks and various other things. Now, Mark Capellas, once the exchange got hacked and it got shut down because it was bankrupt, he actually blamed, rather than saying what happened at the exchange, he blamed it on Bitcoin itself and said it was malicious code. So he tried to discredit Bitcoin by blaming the exchange on Bitcoin itself. That was one of the. And now, what's really interesting is at the same time, if you look at the emails, one of the emails we got was between Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein in 2014, where they were talking about whether they're ready to start the campaign to tarnish Bitcoin. And so everything went wrong in 2014, and Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were communicating on, is this part of the campaign to discredit Bitcoin? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but something along those lines. You can find the exact wording. And this is in 2014 when Brock Pierce came along. You had the bankruptcy of the Bitcoin Foundation. You had the taking out of various board members. You had Mt. Gox get hacked and go bust. You had them blaming Bitcoin the code. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong in 2014. It was like the most disastrous year for Bitcoin. And that was the year that Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were trying to, essentially, they were communicating on, people don't know whether it's a currency or a unit of account or a medium of exchange. So at the same time, Brock Pierce, via however he was funded, and I think his covert mechanisms, managed to get funding into $3 million into Coinbase.
Right.
He also managed to get funding into, not Brock Pierce. Brock Pierce was introduced to Blockstream, and Blockstream was a company that when the Bitcoin Foundation went bust, they kind of they took a bunch of the developers and put it into a corporate structure. And that one of those people was not a Bitcoin developer, but a Bitcoin architect guy that was advising on systems called Adam Back.
Mm.
So to put this all together, you had funding into Blockstream that took a bunch of the developers into a centralized company. You then had money going into Coinbase, that was one of the important companies that later got venture capital funding and all these different large companies. Then Block Peers also funded a developer to create a new project called Realcoin. And Realcoin was a really strange project to us at the time because it basically was a blockchain dollar that existed as a token on top of Bitcoin. And it was later rebranded to be called Tether. And so then he sold that project, Tether, to a company called Bitfinex. And so this was the introduction of Tether, which was essentially the project that now, if you go right forward to today, is involved in Clarity Act, Genius Act, creating a digital dollar, integration into Peter Thiel's Palantir, Elon Musk's social credit score. So it tells you in 2014, there seemed to be a very deliberate operation to use Bitcoin as a gateway drug onto a digital dollar. And so this is, what I think one of the plans was. And the communication between Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein was saying, yeah, the Bitcoin people are a bit crazy. They don't know whether it's a currency, medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. They're very confused.
Mm.
And Peter Thiel said, is this part of the, operation, whatever it may be? So that's how I interpret this. So all of the apparatus was set up in that 2014 to try and infiltrate Bitcoin as many ways as possible.
Just one question on that, Simon. You mentioned Bitcoin Foundation, and you've kind of detailed various aspects of it. One of the people in the Epstein files, I believe, is someone called by the name of Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon apparently is also was involved in Bitcoin Foundation, and that was another means by which allegedly Epstein.
Jamie Dimon's the CEO of JP Morgan.
Okay, and
Yeah.
so is he? Sorry.
I think that would be a fake one. Is that
No,
authenticated?
so what the claim is that Epstein was funding the Bitcoin Foundation and coordinating with Jamie Dimon and many of the large banks to position BTC is basically it.
Yeah, that sounds like narrative on top of the story. What we do know from Epstein,
Okay.
and remember, there's a bunch of red herrings and people putting out fake screenshots and stuff.
They are for sure.
Yeah, yeah. But Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan. We do know that Epstein was, I believe, using allegedly Brock Pierce in order to funnel money and blockchain capital into infrastructure. There's no evidence that that was connected to banks or Jamie Dimon at that stage. And if I see any, then I'll look at it, but I haven't seen any. I can tell you what came next, though.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So at this point, we had the discrediting of all of the board members one by one in the Bitcoin Foundation, and it was left with a guy who kind of the two people that were left. Everyone stepped down or left or resigned or whatever, but it was left with Brock Pierce and John Matonis. John Matonis kind of was the last man standing, like the chairman, and Brock Pierce still hung around. Then we had the handover from Bitcoin Foundation to MIT, the college and the innovation lab within MIT. So around 2015, I think it was, maybe the timeline's a bit off. MIT essentially started creating, Jeffrey Epstein funded into MIT. And then MIT created a new offshoot called DCI, Digital Currency Initiative. And the Digital Currency Initiative took 3 of the core developers and gave some funding to those 3 core developers. Blockstream had offshoot at this time, and it started raising finance. One of their investors was Jeffrey Epstein via Digital Garage, and the CEO was a guy called Adam Back. And Adam Back, in the files that we've seen right now, he confirmed on X that he did take that money It was $500,000 into Blockstream. And there was also confirmation that a guy called Andy Back was on one of the Epstein Islands.
Right.
And then there was another confirmation email that the co-founders of Blockstream, and one of them, Adam Back, they had the name Adam Back, and his co-founders were with flight, confirmations that it was arranged that they'll be going to the island. Adam Back, at this stage, has not confirmed whether he went to the island, but the emails imply that that was arranged and he did go.
So,
Yeah.
yes. Sorry, just continue.
Yeah, so there you got Blockstream, and then you've got a Bitcoin Foundation, which kind of is moved over to this digital currency initiative. And this digital currency initiative funded 3 of the core developers. And then a bunch of developers were in Blockstream. So you could look at those different offshoots. And then you had this covert structure with Brock Pierce. And what did Brock Pierce do? He had Blockchain Capital, a VC. He had Tether, that then was passed on to Bitfinex. And then we had the PSYOP of all PSYOPs, which was John Matonis, who was the chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation that was just a skeleton at this stage.
Right.
He used the credibility of Bitcoin Foundation, the remnants of it, now that everyone had been taken out, to introduce who he said was Satoshi Nakamoto and revealed it to the world. And he introduced Dr. Craig Wright. And Dr. Craig Wright claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto. And then Gavin Andreessen, one of the developers, he came out. He wasn't part of he wasn't part of Blockstream. But Gavin Andreessen, I believe he was one of the developers that was funded via the Digital Currency Initiative. I may have got that one wrong. People can fact check that. I'm just doing this off memory. So I think he was one of the 3 developers, but
Right.
they'll let me know if that's wrong. But anyway, he then lied on BBC and national TV and at this conference saying that he had cryptographic, indisputable evidence that Dr. Craig Wright controlled the Satoshi wallets, and he cryptographically proved it. Now, what that means is that essentially the Satoshi wallets, there was 1 million Bitcoin mined. Only those that have the keys can prove, if you have the keys, you can prove indisputable that you can control those keys just by sending a message on the chain. And Gavin Andreessen lied and said that that happened. Dr. Craig Wright recently went to prison for lying in court and manufacturing PDFs to prove that he was Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, this implies to me, I always thought, is this guy just a psychopath? To me, it sounds like he had no choice. Like, he sent himself to prison, like, went to that right till the end on that lie, as if he had no choice but to do it. So anyway, so you had Gavin Andreessen, John Matonis, and then he took some of the influential characters at the time that then publicly said, yes, I think this is Satoshi. Now, at this time, I was at a conference. I can't remember where it was. I think it was in Mexico or somewhere. And I was speaking. I would speak every year at the annual conferences. The early ones in 2013 were organized by the Bitcoin Foundation. One of them was in Netherlands, and then I think the next one was in Mexico, if I remember correctly. There was one in UK. But at that conference, Brock Pierce, who looks like he was under the influence, made it out like it was really urgent that I speak to him. And so I spoke to him, and he spent probably 2.5 hours, like definitely under the influence, trying to persuade me that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto and that I should publicly, put my support behind him. So I know not through any of these emails, but from my personal experience, he seemed very invested in getting everyone to believe that behind the scenes that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. And at that point, Roger Ver came out and said that he thought it, and he was a big voice. Now, what did that do? This is when, at the same time, one of the ASIC manufacturers in China was a company called Bitmain. And Bitmain got funding from Sequoia Capital, a large venture capitalist at the time. And they created a version of Bitcoin that was called Bitcoin ABC. And they publicly said, if you don't change Bitcoin to have bigger blocks, then we're going to fork off and create a new version of Bitcoin that was later called Bitcoin Cash. And so there was an attempt to create a digital dollar, discredit and infiltrate Bitcoin, and create an alternative, multiple alternatives to Bitcoin. And so all of this was a divide and conquer strategy to fracture the community more and more and more and take people off in different directions. And then we entered into this massive civil war in Bitcoin that looked like a military operation where we were all on the same team, and then everyone fractured off into different parts. And then you had the big blockers and the small blockers and the people that believed via Blockstream that we should invest in layer 2, which is an innovation to scale Bitcoin in a different way. And then Blockstream started creating all that technology. And later created a federated network for banks to launch tokens on top of Bitcoin that could essentially be central bank digital currencies and all sorts of stuff. So you can see that this all fractured all over the place round about 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017 phase. And you can connect it all to those different, trying to get in all those different networks.
That makes sense. Now, going back to the Epstein files, I've got a couple of more questions for you, Simon. The first one is, obviously, in the Epstein files, Jeffrey Epstein claims that he knew the founder of Bitcoin. So the question to you is, and I'll read it out, did Epstein know Satoshi Nakamoto? He says, quote, I've spoken to some of the founders of Bitcoin who are very excited. So was he talking about Satoshi, or who was he talking about?
I checked that one, and I don't think it's actually in the actual files. So I don't think it's. I don't think that's an authenticated email. But I don't know. What was the date of it? Was it 2009?
So the claim is, and I'm not double checked the file. It says the file is EFTA 008154445. In terms of the specific email, is 2016. He sent an email to Rafat, is it Alsbag and Aziza Al Ahmadi, which is the same. I believe she's the UAE based Saudi woman. Oh, sorry.
Okay. I've seen a bunch of really weird emails that look like spoof. Like, for example, one of the characters is a guy that's always on TV. He's like a bit of is a guy called Anthony Pompliano. And there was an email where like he was claiming he emailed Jeffrey Epstein, or someone that said he was him, emailed Jeffrey Epstein and said, I'm a member of the IRGC, and you should give me $10,000. I've got a blackmail operation. And then he forwarded it to the FBI. So, I mean, 2016 saying he knows who Satoshi is. Maybe he does. That's a new one. I haven't seen that one. So I haven't. But if it's authentic, then yeah, you got to also look at the actual, whether the emails are there. Would Jeffrey Epstein know who Satoshi Nakamoto is? I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that. And so if there's something that comes out, I have my own opinion who Satoshi Nakamoto is. I think it was a guy called Len Sassaman.
Right.
And so we'll see.
Why do you think it was Len Sassaman?
So my understanding of the origin story is it came from David Chom, who created DigiCash, and DigiCash was shut down and taken out because it was centralized. And so round about this time, we got the white, after that, we had the white paper launched. And one of the early developers was, Len Sassaman. All of the different evidence around timing, social media posts, his connection to Europe because it wasn't really in American time zones and various other things. Pretty much, I think there's the most compelling evidence that Len Sassaman, and he also was, well, the official story is that he committed suicide, and that coincides exactly with the time frame that Satoshi Nakamoto left the project. And Gavin Andreessen said, one of the early developers, that he was going to meet the CIA. Then Satoshi Nakamoto said, I don't want to be anything to do with this. That was a time when WikiLeaks was also starting to use Bitcoin after the financial blockade. And then Len Sassaman he said he committed suicide. I think I question whether it was a suicide. I don't want to be disrespectful to the family, but he was taken out, and then later Hal Finney also died of natural causes. Apparently, is the allegations. I think these two had the private keys.
So you
I think they were
wait, which two? Who was the two? So Len Sassaman, and who was the
Len
second person?
Sassaman and Hal Finney.
Hal
Yeah,
Finney.
yeah.
So, I mean, just to kind of say, you believe that Len Sassaman was Satoshi Nakamoto, possibly based on what you're theorizing. The CIA kind of wanted access to him and or his wallets, and then they took him out. Possibly.
That's a possibility. Yeah, you got
Right.
to draw a few connections, but I think the case of why he's Satoshi Nakamoto, there's lots of videos out there that people have done the full analysis of every post and the timing of social media and the linguistic analysis and various other things, the timing of his suicide relative to Satoshi leaving the project.
Understood. But why would the CIA want to take him out if, according to your view, it was the CIA who developed Bitcoin?
Well, it was open sourced, and DigiCash wasn't open sourced. And it was, whether it was created as it was meant to be a honeypot with a closed source backdoor, but Len Sassaman open sourced it, and the design was open source.
Right.
And I'm not sure it was meant to be the way it was actually designed, where you couldn't have a backdoor. And so later, I think the project became a gateway drug for a CBDC, which was
Right.
how they pivoted their operation. But if it wasn't open sourced and the design wasn't done with nodes and a distributed supercomputer, then this could have been just like DigiCash, an operation and a honeypot with a backdoor.
So you're basically saying that, in your view, the CIA creates it. They don't plan to make it open source. What happens is he gets involved and he essentially makes it open source, which wasn't the original intention of the CIA. And then what happens is Sassaman becomes the reason why it's open source. And then we've got the current version of the Bitcoin we have. The CIA then want to get basically into a conversation with Sassaman, or maybe get him under control or whatever it is. He refuses, and somehow he allegedly has a suicide, is basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and all of those developers, you can see that they had connections to being called in by intelligence, and there's evidence around all of it, and Gavin Andreessen as well. And then you had basically the Satoshi Nakamoto saying, "I'm leaving the project," when Gavin Andreessen confirmed to Satoshi that he's going to meet the CIA and present what Bitcoin is. And so all of this is, again, you have to connect a few dots. I can't prove that. That's just my experience of what I think happened. I couldn't prove it to you. But it's the story that makes the most amount of sense to me.
Well, that was actually my second question, was whether Epstein was Satoshi, but you've kind of answered that already. Now, in terms of, from a crypto perspective, Bitcoin perspective, what's the kind of biggest takeaway you've got from the release of the Epstein files?
That there were multiple attempts to try and infiltrate. And to me, it just confirms that, Bitcoin, firstly, that Bitcoin resisted all these attempts. There were compromise all along the way. But at every level, we still ended up with a structural design that no single person can control. And so for me, Brock Pierce, I think we got the confirmation that he was the character that I suspected he was. And how many different attempts there were. I also think that everyone's taking their narrative. As the community factioned off into parts, some said, I believe in Adam back. And so you've got the community that are kind of defending that line. Then you've got people that believe blocks should have been big and they ended up with Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV. Everyone's using it as evidence for their narrative rather than taking the full picture that you can see every part was infiltrated. So the people over here are saying, look, Adam back, he was on the island, it's pedo coin, right?
Right.
People over here, I think there's a clear story that the fake Toshi was an op. And in the end, what did we get? Well, we got what we're having today, which is Peter Thiel, AI Palantir, David Sachs, stable coins, and then Elon Musk with social credit scores.
Yeah.
And the mechanism that is being pitched to solve the American debt crisis is programmable money and a stable coin. And so there's a Q-tard op right now to make people believe that Trump is taking on the Federal Reserve and the system. And the end result is you're going to have programmable Orwellian 1984 version of the dollar. And Genius Act ensures that the banks end up with all the power in it anyway. And so you can see these psyops where they've manufactured consent with the Q-tards and the MAGA-tards to believe that Trump's taken down the Fed. The legislation is just moving us to this, this massive police and surveillance state. And Bitcoin was the gateway drug. And now you can discredit Bitcoin by pointing there. You can discredit Bitcoin by pointing over here. But really, you're pushing everyone over to this stable coin. And then you're trying to, and then there was one major operation, which you have to connect a few dots. But what came next after MIT, there was a digital currency initiative. And that was headed up by a guy called Gary Gensler. And Gary Gensler ended up being the head and chair of the SEC. Gary Gensler is in the Epstein files in terms of connections, nothing damning, but conversations. They were introduced, they were connected. The new head of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Wallace, he's also similar types of connections, nothing damning, but similar things. You can see these people know each other or were connected to each other. And then what did Gary Gensler do? Well, he ended up becoming the chair of the SEC. Now, nobody in our industry, it seems like Jeffrey Epstein was able to get a meeting, but there was only one person that was able to get a meeting, despite the fact that Coinbase was the largest company, all these different companies, but no one could get a meeting with the SEC. There was only one person, Sam Bankman-Fried. So Sam Bankman's SBF was the only person that got a meeting, and he was, through his connections, which is on the board was the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which is essentially the law firm involved in Mossad, CIA, all sorts of stuff. And FTX was drafting the legislation for what later became known as Clarity Act today, under Biden and now under Trump. And so you can see this different thing. So what happened under Gary Gensler? Well, there was also other operations. One of the ops that I was involved in is Celsius. And Celsius, I had money on Celsius. I invested because I invested in many of the different companies. And this was the last company I invested in when I said I'm out and I'm divesting from everything. And I'm just keeping Bitcoin in self-custody. This was my last one. Now, when you look at Celsius, it was a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. And FTX was another one of those as well. FTX's board and connections, these are higher up connections to, the college circuit, elites in law firms, like, really an elite circle that had SBF as the front person. But also, Alex Majinsky was the front person for Celsius. Behind the scenes, you had offices in Israel. You had a custody acquisition called GK8, which was an Israeli, custody company. You had his co-founder, Daniel Leone, is now has got an AI startup with their customer being the Prime Minister's Office of Israel. You had his wife, who became head of social media for the IDF and pushed out propaganda to end UNRWA, and take out, UNRWA by connecting it that the UN was part of October the 7th. She was the head of lending at Celsius. And you had all of these different connections. And one of the things that led to some of the loss, that led to Alex Majinsky trying to make up the loss and trading and all sorts of stuff, was a hack from a company called Bancor DAO. And Bancor DAO, the major shareholders, were the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. So you had a hack that led to a catastrophic loss. You had reckless processes. And you had a team of IDF-connected propagandists, and AI cybersecurity and Israeli-connected shills. Now, Alex Majinsky was the only one that went to prison. He went down for 12 years. He took 650,000 victims with him, wiped out the savings of billions of dollars. And the SEC, in the court case, was communicating with Alex Majinsky and Celsius for 2 years during the court documents. And I know that because I read every court documents, 4,000 different court documents over 2 years I read. Most people would never read all this stuff, so they wouldn't know. But the SEC knew about this, and there were ongoing investigations, but it was still allowed to go from a small Ponzi scheme to a $25 billion Ponzi scheme. And so to me, there was a compromised network at the SEC level. And the idea was to discredit the industry, crash the price of Bitcoin down to $15,000 from a high of $70,000. And then one by one, allow BlackRock to approve the Bitcoin ETF. Suddenly you had Michael Saylor appear, who revived this old zombie, 2008 company, and to get as much Bitcoin as possible, lever it up with as much debt as possible, and centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. And then Cantor Fitzgerald and Howard Lutnick suddenly come along and start going out to all the people like Adam Back saying, why don't you take all of your Bitcoin and put it in a company, and then we can issue you some loans against it. And did the same with Jack Mallers and Strike, and started creating all of these Bitcoin treasury companies by trying to co-opt Bitcoiners and get them to just lever up with debt. And just all the business was the most stupid concept that Michael Saylor came up with, which was have a public company, issue debt, sell equity, and buy Bitcoin. So it's just this stupid vehicle of taking Bitcoin that people had in self-custody and making them put it in custody. It all ended up in Coinbase that Jeffrey Epstein invested in the seed round. You connect all of these dots together, and if someone that lived through it, and then you start looking at other operations. Now, me and you, Sulaiman, we met for the first time on Mario's space.
Yeah.
That space was when SBF came up, and Peter Thiel came up and told everyone to take their money out of the crypto-friendly bank, Silicon Valley Bank. Bill Ackman came up and was trying to tell everyone that we'll buy the bank for a dollar if the Fed agrees and FDIC agrees to bail out the banks. And the bank executives at Signature and Silvergate said they're fine. They didn't need the money, but they all got wiped out. And so the three crypto friendly banks, and then Peter Thiel comes along and says, I'm creating a Bitcoin bank. And suddenly Trump introduces the legislation that allows banks to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And then you get Clarity Act that allows JP Morgan to get favorable terms in issuing Federal Reserves and creating stable coins. And then you have a covert CBDC via, this act. And then Trump says, we're going to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. But the language that he uses in the Bitcoin strategic reserve was that we can confiscate Bitcoin and put it as a strategic reserve. And who did he pardon? He pardoned CZ from Binance,
Yeah.
Russ Albright, and co-opted Tether. And remember, Bitfinex got hacked for 120,000 Bitcoin. They're now on the American Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. Russ Albright, his Bitcoin are on the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. But somehow, after he was pardoned, there was like a $30 million transaction where a bunch of Bitcoin showed up on his wallets. All of these different transactions are happening with the Gulf states. And CZ only went to prison for 4 months, but he agreed to hand over the compliance department to the American government and the Department of Justice, who got access to all of the data and then started freezing people's funds in Palestine, in Turkey, in Lebanon,
Yeah.
on request of Israel. And so clearly to me, there was a covert operation to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible, get people onto Tether, confuse people with shitcoins that were all funded by Silicon Valley. All of these different, meme coin, like casinos, all funded by Peter Thiel's funding. All of this gambling that's happening, with Polymarket, suddenly Peter Thiel and his funds start getting in. And you can see that there is, at the highest level, an operation to just create this crypto casino, degenerate gambling, everyone on a surveillance state, stable coin, seize people's Bitcoin to build a Bitcoin strategic reserve rather than buying them.
Yeah.
And the Trump administration is calling it, we're going to make America great again by making it crypto capital of the world. In the meantime, all of the crypto companies, none of them are in America. They're all in Dubai. They're all in British Virgin Islands. They're all in Cayman Islands. They're all in El Salvador and stuff in the tax neutral jurisdictions. So it's a massive psyop, like when you connect the dots together.
And I think that's why what you say is extremely important, which is to have Bitcoin in self-custody. You mentioned how Saylor has essentially leveraged Bitcoin and made it into something that is debt-ridden. You also have, for example, as you mentioned, Coinbase, which is a centralized exchange, which basically has control over your Bitcoin and has control over your assets. And the same with a lot of these trading
And all of
platforms.
the Bitcoin from the Bitcoin ETFs, they're all using Coinbase, with the
Exactly.
exception of a few.
Ex-
So they've got billions of, we're talking this massive honeypot of Bitcoin there.
Yeah, so I'm with you. I think the only way you would have anything that would be where you would have complete control over would be either self custody Bitcoin or physical gold or silver. So I'm with you on that. But
And there's
Simon,
an advantage when you self custody, and I'll leave that, because when you self custody, you run a node, and when you run a node, you verify your own transactions. And so I know that's geeky, but the elites still want the exit, which is Bitcoin in self custody, where you run your own nodes, and anyone else can have that as well. They can't stop you from doing it, but what they do want to do is they want to control the price, make you sell your Bitcoin or borrow against your Bitcoin, get you trading and leveraging shitcoins, because they want to suck up as much of the Bitcoin as possible, and the elites will be using it in self custody. And so the real movement here is, I believe that we are witnessing an operation to say that Bitcoin is pedo coin created by Jeffrey Epstein, and it's Israel and Mossad, because they're taking the half truths of all this centralized attack vectors,
Mm.
but we still have the largest, most distributed supercomputer around countries all around the world. We still have 25,000 people running nodes that anyone can run.
Mm.
We still have the ability to hold Bitcoin in self custody. And what they want is for you to borrow against your Bitcoin so that essentially Howard Lutnick and his sons, and Donald Trump and his sons, and Steve Witkoff and his sons, that have created an infrastructure, can engage in market manipulation to take your Bitcoin so that they end up with it, centralizing it, and then they can use it to manipulate the short-term price of Bitcoin as well. So you don't have the freedom, but they still want the freedom.
Yeah, they want the freedom and the control. Simon, first of all, obviously, really appreciate you. You're a close friend of mine. Where can people find you? You're on X. On X, it's Simon Dixon Twit, right?
Yeah.
And that's
I mean,
you find you on X. And on YouTube, it's Simon Dixon 21, I believe, right?
yeah, at Simon Dixon 21. But if you put Simon Dixon in, you'll find a 15-year-old YouTube channel where I've documented this whole journey from before Bitcoin, from the monetary reform days. And then every week I do a real geeky breakdown like this of everything that happened this week in macroeconomics, geopolitics, and Bitcoin and tech, but just focus on monetary flows rather than anything else.
Well, first of all, your channel is very informative, and I've learned quite a lot, especially from the crypto aspect and the financial aspect from you. So I definitely recommend people following your channel, Simon Dixon 21, where you do a very detailed explanation once a week on Fridays, and also your X page, which is a Simon Dixon Twit, where you tweet and really give up to date information. But is there anywhere else anyone can find you, Simon? Because you're a man of all fields.
Yeah, I'm trying to get into decentralized social media. I'm still find myself on X, but I'm on Noster. At some point, we're going to have to get over there if you use Noster. You can look me up over there. And those are the two platforms. But if everything goes wrong, I back everything up at simondixon.com and created an infrastructure in case I get cancelled. And of course, I regularly join Sulaiman Spaces. We both took a stand on. We were on the top stages on Spaces, like that's where we met with all these SBF operations and stuff. And we clearly saw a bias that was forming on X Spaces, and so we forked off, and took the unpopular thing of supporting Palestine at the time, which is now the popular view. But and so I decided to join Sulaiman Spaces. So I regularly contribute there because I don't want to support the Zio propaganda.
Yeah, and you're there daily, so people get your real life knowledge and information every day. And we are now the biggest spaces. So I really appreciate you, Simon. Uh, and thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. And we'll probably get to do this again when there's more news about Bitcoin, because according to you, they're trying to take you boys out. So there's going to be more attack vectors. Appreciate you as always.
Yeah, and I recommend any of Suleiman's interviews with Ryan Dawson or any of his documentaries and stuff, because that's where I really learned this Epstein stuff from, and then I kind of combined it with my own experience. But it's really important to understand this stuff. So thank you for everything you've done, Suleiman, as well. It's been a wild couple of years since being involved in this cause, and I think we're all smarter for it at the end. So just want to show some appreciation for your work as well.
Well, much love to you as well, Simon. I think you've been a juggernaut, and you've basically really helped people over these last few years. And I know we're going to be working on other projects as well in the future. So appreciate you as always, Simon. Thank you so much.
All right, bye bye.